My dog was lost in the woods for a week. Whatever came back is not my dog. Listen, forget everything you think you know about the universe and the world. None of it matters. What I will tell you about what happened in that fucking forest is true. I will not stretch the story. I will not do some random bullshit story. I will only tell you what fucking happened. The truth. I had a cabin house in the forest of Great Lakes, Canada. It was the middle of summer, so I decided that I could also bring my dog Maple. Maple was a German Shepherd and a smart one at that. She knew exactly what she was doing, she knew how to handle a situation, and above all, she was a good friend. We got to my cabin in the forest, unpacked my and Maple's stuff, and I decided that since it was the summer and I had virtually nothing to do while I was on vacation, I could take Maple for a stroll through the forest. Before I took Maple out on the walk, I decided that I'd take a quick nap as I rarely get them anymore. I simply have too much on my hands nowadays, you know. Once I wake up from my nap, Maple wants to be taken outside immediately, and I do as she wishes. The sun is pounding down on me and Maple, and the heat from it feels like you're staring into hell itself. Of course, you're not actually staring into hell, you're just walking on the planet that prepares you for hell. While on our walk, we notice some strangely shaped pinnacones and leaves. I could have also sworn that I saw something that looked unhumanoid behind a tree. I brush it off as me being tired, and my eyes playing tricks on me, because that is the most logical explanation at the time. We get back to the cabin after about an hour-long walk. I make myself bacon and pour some syrup on it, and eat away. Of course, Maple will do anything for syrup, which is partly why we called her Maple, and I give her my scraps and head to bed. I wake up at around 4 in the morning to Maple scratching on the door wanting to be taken outside, so I do as she needs, and I take her outside. She does her business and we begin to walk back to the cabin, but before we enter in, Maple sits down and looks at the forest. Just looks. Nothing else. I look at her and she turns her head looking at me. Her face. It looks like she knows something bad is in that forest. Something evil. Something demonic. I look into the forest, and to no one's surprise I see nothing. I call for Maple and she wouldn't move. Come on Maple, I tell her. Still, no movement. She's breathing heavily, and begins to bark. What is she barking at? I begin to think. Still, I need to get myself and Maple back to bed. I begin to somewhat pull her leash, causing her to get mad at me for moving her, when she so desperately wants to keep barking at whoever or whatever is in the forest. I finally drag her inside and get myself to sleep. Maple wouldn't sleep. She just sat at the nearest window looking at the forest. Now this is bullshit, I begin to tell myself. But I needed sleep, and since she wasn't causing any harm, I thought I could just leave her there, and she'd find sleep at some point. When I wake up and open my door, Maple is still sitting there. She doesn't even pay attention to me opening the door. Maybe I just need to take her to the vet, I begin to wonder. I sit down at the table, considering the thought. I make myself some Eggos, and as soon as I pour the maple syrup on them, she looks at me and begins to walk over. Ah, you just wanted something to eat, didn't you? I give her some of my waffles. Good girl. I tell her as she eats her food. I was finally able to get her to stop staring at the damn door. Although, I don't feel safe enough to take her to the forest anymore, I will take her on a walk on the outskirts of the forest. She does her business as soon as we go outside, and I take her on a walk. This time, she is scared to go into the forest. She wouldn't even stay on my right, which is closer to the forest. She would only stay on my left, no matter what. I even tried moving her to my right, but she wouldn't budge. As we were walking, I could have sworn I saw the same unhumanoid figure looking at us from the forest. This time, I don't brush it off as my eyes playing tricks on me, because Maple saw it, too. She just sat there like she did an hour ago. I knew something was wrong. The creature that was looking at us walked away. Maple, instead of deciding to get up and run to the cabin, ran towards the forest. You see, Maple was always a good dog. If she ran away, I could call for her and she'd come back, meaning there was no purpose for a leash. When she ran into the forest, I called for her, but this time, she wouldn't come back. I tried to run for her, but God was she fast. I couldn't catch up to her, and I fell on a stick while I was running towards her. Although Maple didn't come back to me when I first called for her, I assumed that she would know the way back because she was good with stuff like that. I assumed that whatever was looking at us was probably a deer or something, so I didn't worry too much. I walked back to the cabin and waited. Yet Maple never came. One day passed and I thought, alright, maybe she's a little lost. I'll call out to her. And so I did. I went outside and spent around an hour just sitting and calling to her. I heard something come from the woods and got my hopes up. Sadly, it was just a flock of birds. I went to my room and began to cry. Call me a pussy or whatever you want, but that dog was mine. I got her when I was 14, and to lose a pet after having it for so long is the worst feeling ever. I awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of something knocking at my door. I walked over to open the door, but before I could, I began to feel uneasy. Like the feeling you get when you think that someone or something is watching you, knowing your every move, your breathing pattern, your blinking pattern. I slowly backed away from the door when I heard in a low, monotone, and mocking voice say, "Come here, Maple. Don't run. Bad girl." And then I froze. Whoever was on the outside of the door knew Maple's name and knew the exact words I said to her when she ran into the forest. I tried to ignore the person on the other side, but they would not go away. They kept knocking and mocking me, calling for my dog to not run away, and at one point, they even said that they're watching. Now, did I know what that meant? No. But it sure as hell scared me. I tried to find sleep, but I couldn't. All night long, whatever was on the outside of the door wouldn't stop. Eventually, though, I did find sleep. Of course, it was after hours of fear and crying. But I did find sleep. I wasn't able to recover from Maple missing. Every day, I would eat a bunch of maple syrup because it was her favorite thing in the world. I mourned, yes. But I also felt angry at her for leaving me. If only she wasn't such a bad dog. I began to think. But as soon as I would think stuff like that, I would always turn the blame on me for being a bad owner. What did I do wrong? Was it my fault for not putting a leash on her? Was the kind of stuff I thought. This kept going for a couple days, but one day, while I was taking a nap, I woke to hear scratching at the door. I leapt with joy, beginning to hope that it was Maple. And when I opened the door, my hopes came true. But there was something different about her. For one, she was very malnourished, but that made sense as she was a big dog that needed to eat, and when she's in the forest alone. God, it must have been horrible for her. But besides her being malnourished, she was also acting different. Now, since Maple is about 7 years old, the word maple syrup is kind of engraved in her head. Normally, when I would say, "Want maple syrup, girl?" she would wag her tail and follow me. This time when I asked her the same question, she looked at me. Her eyes looked different. I can't explain how they were different, I can just tell you that they were. She also began to slowly growl. I began to question whether this was my dog or not, but I guess I wanted to see Maple so badly that I didn't care. She wouldn't sit next to me while I watched TV. I went to bed. I wake up to hear knocking at my door. It's literally the middle of the night. 12 a.m. to be exact. Whoever was behind that door somehow knew I was in the room. The knocking stopped, and for a second, I thought I was safe. But then, I begin to hear clapping, not any old clapping, but the special clapping I do for Maple's attention. It even has the same rhythm to it. Clap, wait 1 second, clap, wait 2 seconds, clap, wait 1 second, clap, rinse and repeat. And as it's clapping, it says in a familiar low, monotone, and mocking voice, "Oh, goody. Maple is back, that's just a joy." It was also a joy to rip and eat her insides. What the fuck? I don't know what was behind that door, but it was not human. It began to clap again, and just as it did, I realized that whatever I let into my cabin was not my dog. I let something more sinister into my house. I tried to sleep and hope whatever was behind the door wouldn't realize that I didn't lock it. I finally was asleep. Once I woke up, I packed my shit up, not even taking Maple's toys and food, because it wouldn't matter now, and left as fast as I fucking could. I didn't believe in ghosts, or demons, or spirits, or anything of the sort. But what I think I encountered that night was a skinwalker. Ever since that night I let whatever that thing was into my cabin. I turned to religion. It was the only thing I could do instead of commit suicide, of course. Which, I tried. Oh, yes, I tried. People think skinwalkers don't exist, but they do. They exist, but they're hiding. They're hiding ready to strike at humans. I'm lucky I left that cabin alive. I don't ever go back to my cabin in Great Lakes, Canada. It's faint, but sometimes I can swear I hear a clapping in the same rhythm I did for Maple when I'm alone in my house. If you or a family member or a friend or anyone thinks of going to Great Lakes, Canada, try to stop them. It might seem like an innocent fun place, but there is something more sinister and eviler than any of us can imagine, and it's hiding in the forest. Don't go to Great Lakes, Canada. Ever. Never shoot a skinwalker. My two buddies and I went on a hunting trip for bull elk last November, and we were having a great time, to say the least. That, however, soon would change after what we saw on the third day. Now, I'm not one for superstition and I don't believe in ghosts at all, but what we saw out there really changed my view about those sorts of things. The trip started out normally after we parked our trailers at camp. We got there a day early before the hunt officially started so we could settle in and get some scouting done. Only Eric and I had licenses because Brian didn't draw out this year, but he wanted to come along with us anyway. Brian also brought along his German Shepherd named Lucy, which stayed back at camp with a leash that was connected to a metal spike. The spike was so deep in the ground that I wondered if we would be able to get it out. I asked Brian, and he just told me that his dog was so strong that it had to be that deep. I enjoyed playing with Lucy. She was always excited to see me and would greet me by jumping up on two legs and trying to lick my face. Eric, however, was not amused by her and would constantly yell at her to leave him alone. Anyway, the first 2 days we saw so many cow elk in valleys and on sides of the mountains that I thought for sure we would see some bulls out there, but there were none among them. It wasn't until the third day of the hunt that we saw a bull elk, but it was too far away to take a shot at. And even if we were able to hit it, it would take hours trying to pack that thing out. So that evening we decided to hunker down next to some fallen trees and were able to watch a hillside. While we were surveying the area, Brian spotted a coyote about 250 yards walking to a small pond of water strangely, as if it was maimed. Eric took out his binoculars to take a closer look, and he started to describe it saying, "That coyote, it isn't right looking. It has a hunch on its back like a bear, and its jaw, oh man, its damn jaw seems like it's been broken, and now it's just drooping there like a dead fish." "Let me see those binoculars," I asked curiously with an outstretched hand. Eric handed them to me, and as he did, he seemed to grasp his gun tightly. I took them and looked at the animal and said, "You're right, that thing's jaw is just hanging there. Also, did you happen to notice its hair? It's so long and unevenly dispersed." I then handed the binoculars to Brian and he looked at the coyote for 1 second and screamed. "Brian, shut up. We're hunting," Eric whispered harshly. "What did you see?" I asked as I looked at his shocked facial expression. Brian looked at his feet as he muttered, "I saw my dog Lucy, but it wasn't her. I don't know what that was. It couldn't have been your dog. When I looked at it, it looked like a dying coyote. It didn't have the large black spot on its back or your dog's strawberry red sides and underbelly," I said in a plain yet confused manner. "Well, since we aren't going to see anything out here, because you screamed like a baby, I'm going to put that coyote out of its misery," Eric said angrily as he raised his rifle and looked through the scope. A large shot followed, and we saw the animal drop down soon after. It was a clean kill, and Eric was curious about seeing what was wrong with the animal up close, so he started getting ready to hike out. As he got his stuff together, he said, "You probably just didn't get a good look at it, Brian. Your dog is fine." Brian stood up and as he brushed the dirt off his buddy replied, "I swear I saw my dog, but an evil demented version of it with human eyes, but you guys are probably right. There's no way she could have had the strength to yank out the metal stake holding her back at camp." "Well, let's go find out the truth about this animal," I said somewhat excitedly as I started walking toward the dead animal. It took us about half an hour to hike over to it, and we lost sight of the animal's corpse as we had to pass through some trees. Once we finally got to the spot where the animal had dropped, there was no corpse, just a puddle of blood. However, the blood was blackish and very dense. Eric observed the scene and started to scratch his head as he said, "I could have sworn I shot that thing straight through its heart. There's no way it could have just gotten back up and walked off." I had an eerie feeling about the whole situation, and Brian was still afraid that it might have been his dog that got shot. Eric, however, noticed a trail of blood leading into a dark tree line. Without asking, he started to follow it and he loaded his gun. As he did, me and Brian were both freaked out and just watched Eric as he went into the forest. He soon went out of sight and Brian and I could not leave him here, so we waited. I passed the time by taking a skinny stick and poking at the puddle of blood. It smelled terrible and the aroma hit me pretty hard, so much so that my stomach convulsed and I threw up. "You okay?" Brian asked as he put his hand on my back. Before I could answer, there was a loud shot that echoed through the trees and we both looked at the direction it came from. "Must have found the animal," I said as I spit into the grass. As soon as I said this, we could now see Eric, but he was full on sprinting. "Run!" he screamed as he ran at us. I noticed that he must have dropped his gun because he wasn't carrying it. I was about to ask him what happened, but Brian grabbed my arm and yanked me towards where we had parked the truck. Without hesitation, I ran. We soon made it back to the truck and my shoulder hurt from the rubbing of the gun strap. I looked back at Eric, who slowed down for nothing. I soon looked behind him and saw nothing chasing us. So, I opened the truck and got in without worry. Eric then climbed in and told me to hit the gas and go. I was so perplexed on what Eric saw out there, and I knew that he hardly ever got scared of anything, so this started to freak me out. I started driving fast back to camp and I asked Eric, "What did you see out there that was scary enough to make you drop your gun?" "I don't know, man, that was no damn animal." I followed the trail of blood and it stopped at the base of a tree, and I was wondering how a coyote was able to climb a tree, but when I looked up, I saw this hairy humanoid creature there. It smelled so freaking bad. Eric went on about how scary that thing was and how he was done with the hunting trip and wanted to go home. We soon pulled into camp and mutually decided that we were going home. I started to pack my things and then felt like something was missing. I then thought to myself, "Lucy, where is Brian's dog? She usually always is so excited to see us back at camp. She can't stop barking and whining to be set free." As soon as I thought this, Brian started screaming and crying. I ran over to where he was and saw that his dog was gone. However, on further inspection, I noticed what Brian was looking at. Something had pulled out the metal stake in the ground and strung Lucy up on a nearby tree and had skinned her. Brian just could not stop crying and Eric ran over to see what was wrong and just stood there, jaw dropped and frozen. He then muttered, "She was skinned alive. There's a bunch of bruising caused by struggling around her neck where the collar is." "Shut up, Eric, you ain't helping," I said as I put my shoulder around Brian, who had unstrung his dog's body from the tree. "Skinwalker," Eric said in a low tone of voice as he looked into the distance. He then screamed, "It's a damn skinwalker." I followed his gaze and saw an animal that looked like Lucy, but it had human eyes and a sickly green glazed looking coat of fur. Brian stopped crying and just stood there, eyes locked on the beast. Eric then whispered with his voice quivering, "We all run to the truck on a count of 3. Just leave everything else." Brian and I slowly nodded and agreed to the plan. "Okay, 3, 2, 1. Eric whispered sharply, and we all took off like a pack of gazelles for the truck. We hopped in and as soon as we did, we saw the skinwalker lunge at us and struck the right side door with such a powerful blow that nearly tipped over the whole truck. It didn't stop me whatsoever, and I drove out of there faster than I ever could have. After that, none of us ever went hunting again in that area. We never even went back to claim our camping trailers and supplies. It was too terrifying to think that what happened to Brian's dog could happen to us, and that thing would walk around in our skin. Since that experience, I am now a superstitious person. You all need to chill about skinwalkers. I've been lurking around the subreddit for a while now, reading some of the biggest hits and the like. This is the first time I've actually made an account. First of all, let me thank each and every one of you for making me feel less alone. I've seen and done some crazy things in my life, and I'm not proud of some of them. Reading all of your stories makes me feel more normal. Now that's over, you all need to chill about the Skinwalkers. I mean, the second you see someone talk about their experiences in a forest, you all run around screaming Skinwalker, like it's the end of the whole world, and they're definitely going to die. And you do that regardless of where they are geographically, what time of year it is, or even the types of events they're experiencing. Honestly, it's enough to make me want to bang my head against the wall sometimes. First of all, they aren't even skinwalkers. Skinwalkers probably don't even exist anymore, since the Navajo culture has dwindled significantly, and, to my knowledge, there have been no Navajo shamans who have rejected their faith in recent years. It's possible there's one or two still around, but they're going to be low in number and in northeast Arizona and parts of New Mexico. They're desert dwellers and aren't even found in forests. The creatures that you're calling skinwalkers have never been given a proper name, but I've called them voice takers, since I first encountered one when I was 12 or so. Back then, I lived with my parents in the forests of Northern California way off the beaten track. I mean, it was like an hour drive to the nearest town. It was that isolated. Our family had lived there for almost 40 years, so the creatures in the forest more or less left us alone, until I got old enough to wander into the woods by myself. They were always curious about me, and more than once I had one knocking on my window in the early hours of the morning, but I don't count those as encounters, because I was never in any real danger. The first time one properly got to me, I was 12 years old and out in the forest alone for the first time. It was my first year going to school instead of being homeschooled by my mother, and I, like most 12-year-olds, hated school. So, I went into the forest to blow off some steam. It was getting dark already, and was approaching sunset, which is important because voice takers, like most of the creatures in the forest, are nocturnal. I was walking along one of the trails, not paying attention to where I was going, when I heard someone call my name. They sounded just like my mother. So, I called back, "Mom." And, of course, it called to me again. Let me just say that this voice taker was smart. In fact, it was the smartest voice taker that I've ever come across. Most of the time, they aren't much more intelligent than your average dog, which is why they usually imitate animals. That's just as effective as using a human voice. You would not believe the number of campers who will follow the sound of a dog barking in the forest for miles. Anyway, it was calling me from the direction of my house. So, of course, I turn around and start heading back towards the house and towards the voice taker. It's still calling me, and I'm yelling back every couple minutes. And then it says, "Alicia, I can hear you. Come over here." It sounded like my mother was terrified. I never saw my mother afraid before or after this incident, but I knew that she was then. This voice taker does fear and anxiety really well, by the way. Before I moved away from that house, I could pick it out of a crowd because it always sounds hurt. So I start panicking a little, not knowing why she was upset. I could tell that my mom was off the path, so I stepped off of it and kept following the sound of her voice, all the while telling her I was coming and to just wait for me. I get to where her voice is coming from, and it's coming from right behind this big tree. I walked around it, and the voice taker was there. One of the things you guys always get right is that voice takers don't want to be seen. They prefer to stay hidden until the very last second, and there is a damn good reason for that. They are ugly and awkward and won't pass for anything besides a voice taker when you lay eyes on them. This one was standing upright with its back against the tree, with its huge circular mouth hanging open, humpbacked with its shoulders at an awkward angle. One of its legs had been broken at some point, and it was standing awkwardly. It was scary as hell to hear my mother's voice echoing out of that gaping circular hole it called a mouth. "There you are, Alicia," it said. I tried to run away, obviously, but it grabbed me. It wasn't much larger than I was, and it was skeletal and weak looking, but being grabbed by it felt like I was being held by an adult 3 times my size. It threw me to the ground and climbed on top of me. That mouth expanded vertically, and then the rest of its body did too, like it had a zipper from the top of its head all the way down to its belly button. Flesh peeled backwards and opened up, exposing the inside of its body. The bones went too. the ribs and skull flexing like they were made of rubber. It was hollow inside, except for these pale sacs of flesh that hung pulsating from the inside of its rib cage, and what looked like tonsils in its throat. I was trying to scream, but by then the weight of its body had pressed all the air out of my lungs. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest, and I couldn't move my arms or legs. Those pale organs inside of its ribcage started to grow and reach toward my face, and my adrenaline spiked so hard I felt my consciousness try to leave my body. It gave me a needed boost of clarity and awareness of my body. I managed to get my legs up against the voice taker and started kicking the inside of its torso, contorting my body to keep my face as far away from its organs as possible. After a couple seconds of that, it shifted to hold down my legs, and I got my arm loose. To this day, I don't know why I thought it was a good idea, but I reached out and punched it in the tonsil. It screamed so loud and in so many different voices all at once that my senses almost couldn't handle it. It was like being blasted full volume with every action movie fight scene all at once. My ears started ringing and I actually thought I had died for a moment. Then I realized I was still alive and I punched again, hitting the other voice sac this time. The same thing happened again, and the voice taker was finally stunned enough to loosen its hold on me a little bit. I kicked it off of me and got to my feet. I seized the nearest large stick and hit the thing in the head twice. Then its zipper started to close up again. Instead of leaving well enough alone, I grabbed whatever I could from the ground and stuffed it inside. Rocks, leaves, beetles, flowers, pine needles, it all went into that voice taker. I wasn't able to get much in there, but what I did manage was enough to make it retch and spill open again, its body literally turning inside out. While it was lying there writhing and flapping like a demonic manta ray, I stood up, still holding the stick I had used to beat it. Which is when I noticed there were 3 more watching me from the tree line. At this point, it was almost fully dark, but I could make them out because my entire body was aware of their shape now, like how you instantly recognize a snake when you see one. I was dead terrified, but I was angry too at that point, and I knew they wouldn't just let me leave. So, I screamed as loudly as I could, "What the fuck do you want? I'll beat you all too." But none of them approached me, and after a few seconds, I backed away from all 4 of them. When none followed, I took my new stick and ran all the way back to the house. I was bleeding from the ears and temporarily deaf for about 10 minutes afterward, and sometimes I still hear ringing in my ears because of it. The voice takers never tried to lure me away ever again. I would tell you that I don't know why they all didn't pile onto me that night and kill me, but that would be a lie. I won't tell you why right now though. If people ask, I might explain later, but for now, let's just say that there's a whole lot more than voice takers in most forests, and they're like coyotes or foxes in terms of the food chain, mostly feeding off scraps and remains other creatures leave behind. I learned later that their diet mostly consists of leaves and grass, that they only go after humans and other large animals during their breeding season, which begins in late summer and extends to mid-fall. The other thing that I learned later is why punching that voice taker in the tonsil. They collect sounds in the sacs in their throat. I don't know how, but they literally capture voices and release them back out. The voice taker that attacked me must have been hanging around the house for months or years, catching fragments of my mother's voice, in order to catch me off guard. When I punched those sacs, I released all of the sounds that the voice taker had stored up. It was the equivalent of punching someone's breath out of them, but like I had actually managed to collapse its lungs. Now, obviously, I don't recommend dealing with voice takers this way, since you'll probably just be eaten by others, even if you incapacitate one in this way. Instead, if you think you're being attacked by voice takers, set up speakers facing outwards from your house or campsite and play something with a whole bunch of voices in it. Sitcoms and comedy show with ensemble casts are best, especially if they have a laugh track. The voice taker will be so preoccupied with collecting new voices and sounds that it will probably stop trying to attack you for that night, and then instead of hearing the voices of your friends or animals calling you from the woods, you get to hear snippets of dialogue from the office for a week or so. It's good fun, and a lot less difficult to explain away. Plus, you'll give the other creatures in the woods a laugh with it, which is always a good first impression. If voice takers are your biggest problem, you've gotten off easy. I should mention that some of the other creatures that stories here have lumped in under the title Skinwalker are different from the voice takers and are a whole lot more difficult to deal with. But I don't want to make this any longer than it already is, and I'm not convinced you'll take my advice even if I gave it. Thank you all for reading, and I hope you appreciate my advice and story. It's really helped me to type this out and get it off my chest. I never told anyone about what happened with the voice takers, not even my parents. Neither of them believed in their existence, and I never got the chance to prove it to them.